Bleep it
All
up.
right, all right. Welcome to
What
another
up?
episode of Spooky Software. I'm very excited by today's episode. So this one is a little bit of a talking head video rather than a more technical deep dive or coding oriented video. But nonetheless, I have my close friend, longtime close friend, James Hughes on the line. We're going to be talking about what it means to be a senior engineer. What is a senior engineer? What is the metamorphosis someone goes through to become a senior engineer? What does a senior engineer do during their day? How do you level up to become a senior engineer? This is a hotly debated topic. I know in the industry, the concept of what a senior engineer is relatively controversial. Everyone has a slightly different idea.
I think we have our own opinions in this one, and
Yeah,
so our opinions may not be the same as everyone else's. But speaking for our own personal experience here, I'm hoping we get to that.
absolutely, absolutely. And
Yeah.
speaking about our personal experience, it is, I think, important to bring in that context for the viewer watching. So both of us, both James and I, have roughly the same numbers of professional year experience working in the industry as a software engineer. Roughly, what are we at now, James? Like, is it 9
Too long.
years? 9 years? Okay.
I don't know, man.
Yeah, give or take 9 years, let's say.
Longer
Right?
than I think it is.
Yeah, so maybe combined, we have 20 years experience, right? Something like this.
Around there, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So, and both of us have spent our entire careers working at sort of what we would classify as technology companies. What's going to make this potentially a little bit interesting is James and I basically have polar opposite experiences when it comes to sort of the size of companies we work at. So,
You can say that.
So I'll begin with, of course, with my experience. So I have spent my entire career working for software startups. That is to say, companies that are somewhere between 2 and like maybe 250 employees, maybe like maxing out at about 30 or 35 engineers, kind of this size or order of magnitude, right? Usually private companies, right? And this kind of thing. So, James, why don't you talk a little bit about your experience and what you've been doing for the last 10 years?
So, I mean, I did start out in like a very small consulting company for my internship for
I
about
had
a year
forgotten
there.
about that. Yeah.
I honestly I forget half the time too. So I did that for a little bit. There was a much different kind of atmosphere and setup there as far as like professionalism. Not to say they were unprofessional or anything, but as far as the maturity of the internal solutions you use went and of the expectations of your roles. I then kind of moved up to like a contractor position for like a medium-sized fintech company before moving on to Amazon, where I've been at in the AWS infrastructure division for the last about 7 years ish.
Yeah.
June 2014. So
Okay.
we're going right up at about 7 years.
Okay. Wow. Fantastic.
And recently have just left that spot too. So like let's say quite a little bit more of the gamut there, but the vast majority of my experience has been on the corporate side.
Yeah.
The big corp.
And by your estimate, what is the number of engineers that Amazon employs?
Oh God, in Seattle, I think we're like 40 to 50,000 right now, and that's just in Seattle. I think globally we have maybe about 100K. Somewhere around, I mean, it depends like what you qualify as an engineer versus like because I'm not sure in your accounts if you're including exclusively engineers, if you're including like all supporting roles such as like technical project managers and like actual management, et cetera, et cetera. But if we're talking just like corporate side, like like you're not like a picker at a warehouse, you're not like Amazon Logistics or honestly, even excluding stuff like data techs and whatnot, I think we're somewhere around 100K, but I'm probably way off in that number. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm allowed to say after I saw that internal stuff anyway. So
Yeah. So let's just say a lot, right? Probably maybe the biggest, right? In that you could ever.
no, there's definitely some consulting companies with more, but that gets a bit murky, So it's up there, like one of the biggest, I'd say.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. So anyway, but nonetheless, both of us, one thing is, we both work for technology companies, and not only that, but, Amazon and the startups that I have worked for, they are like, web companies, right? So perhaps, you might get a slightly different, answer to this question of what a senior engineer is if you talk to somebody who works in like 3D games, like maybe the gaming industry, or somebody who works in like embedded devices or hardware or something like this, right?
Or you're doing some kind of like internal system for a car wash or whatnot. There's always,
IoT. There's also all kinds of stuff, and so. But
small business,
but you even though Amazon is a web company, you actually spend a lot of time on like data center stuff, right?
Yeah, so specifically, I was in the AWS infrastructure division at Amazon, which is doesn't touch anything to do with retail or Prime Video, Kindle, none of that stuff. And even inside of AWS, and I'm not sure what audience watches this, but if you're unfamiliar with AWS, it's the premier cloud computing platform, largest one out there right now. And but even though it's like providing services is its main bread and butter, there's still a lot of teams inside of there. For example, sales and support, and then my side infrastructure, which is how the data center is actually run, supporting software to get that to happen.
Right, right. Okay, well, so anyway, well, with that, now that we have some good context, we can jump right into this, James.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, before we go actually into this,
Yeah, before we go into that part, let's talk about like
one thing I was going to ask you about is actually title inflation, right?
Oh, yeah.
So this is like something that the industry's been talking a lot about lately, and there are definitely people out there with maybe 3 to 5 years of experience who have, senior titles, right? And there's an open question of like whether or not that's, appropriate, right? And so, for instance, you certainly have more than 3 to 5 years of experience, but you actually didn't hold a senior title at Amazon. And maybe you could go into a little bit about how titles worked at Amazon.
How titles work? Actually, so at Amazon, it's fairly straightforward. They have a document they give you. It's a very well written document. I wish I could share it, but of course, there's NDAs and shit. But essentially, there's like a grid there as far as your expectations goes over like many different attributes and like different different areas and whatnots. And the general theme is that when you get hired, even as like an L4, which is our entry level engineer, like you can kind of call it a junior engineer, you're expected to be like like pretty damn good at your solid in your. Sorry, don't mean to swear for the children here, but on your algorithms and data structures, you don't really expect to be much better about that over time because we're expecting you to be kind of at the top of your game with your ability to apply and understand and use those. What you do grow in, though, is more about like your influence and scope and your ability to be a leader. And so like the longer, like not the longer, but like the higher up in the rankings and the tiering system you go, the more ambiguity you're expected to face. And the better you are expected to tackle and manage that ambiguity. So for us, we definitely consider like a senior engineer like a leadership position. I'd say in general amongst like what we call like the FANG companies, it's all of them like are pretty hard to like to get hired and whatnot. But I feel like Amazon is notorious for the mid-level L5 position being like very broad and very wide. Mm-hmm. And depending on which team you're on and depending on the needs and like your individuality and all that kind of stuff, there is a big difference in role between like a newly promoted L5 and like in some orgs and like, like a long-term L5 and some other orgs and whatnot. And honestly, I've known some people there more so at the L6 to L7 role where they kind of don't want to get promoted because the expectations are just so much higher and they don't feel like it's sustainable for them to do it long term. So that's all about the progress there for like why you might like be at one role or another, and the breadth as far as like within a given role. But as far as the concrete expectations and whatnot goes, beyond just ambiguity and all that you're dealing with, like you're expected to do much more around like the team as well. I don't think there's much title inflation at Amazon. I think in some places there definitely are, but at least in the software engineering role at Amazon, I don't think there's a lot of title inflation.
Yeah.
Other roles, like I'm not going to express my opinions on those, but I think in general for Amazon, engineering specifically is not a lot of title inflation.
Yeah.
But wait, what do you feel? Like, how is that
Yeah, so my experience is the complete opposite, which is to say, so I mean, part of that is because the companies that I've worked for, it might be the case that they don't even have a ladder, right? Sometimes, if you're at a very small company or a very young company, you're just trying to survive. You're just trying to build a product that people will actually pay for. You have less resources to dedicate to, like, for instance, drawing up or building a ladder document, right? And this is really important, don't get me wrong. But like, it's hard to prioritize that when you have so many other like things that are going on. And you don't have people who are thinking about it full time. That is certainly the case, right?
So when you say a ladder document here, you mean like is it the individual that like maybe looking at a promotion is writing this ladder document, or is it more like your
No, no,
company,
no.
the management is trying to write a?
Earlier you were describing this grid document where there's like
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
like what
Okay.
describes like an L5 and L6, the same thing, right? Like what
From the management's
describes,
perspective,
yeah.
like what do we think of as the role for a senior
Exactly,
engineer?
exactly. And
Okay.
both companies, both long-term companies I've worked for did not have ladder documents for a long time, right? And so it's just one of those things that because of that, because of this ambiguity, because of this, like, no one has thought about this full time. Culturally, it may not have developed strongly yet, right? You may not have all of these roles filled, right? You may not actually have anyone on staff who is of like L6 or L7, right? There may not actually exist, right? Because you might have 5 people on staff, right? So
Well,
given all of those things, right? Also another thing is, we'll potentially go into this when we talk a little bit more about what senior engineers do. Sometimes this may be counterintuitive, but sometimes startups don't have a lot of high level work to do. Like they're very like grunt based, right? It's like things like we need a login form, right? Like you don't need a principal engineer. In fact, you don't want a principal engineer to make a login form, right? So
yeah, you're the board of doing that or
yeah,
something.
one of the things I would say is that I think both of us agree. You said that, there's kind of this very wide kind of L5 at Amazon, sort of this like, it's basically like
mid-level engineer.
Yeah, like entry senior is kind of how you would describe L5 or
Entry,
something.
normal, and then senior, I'd say. So like L4, L5, L6. L4 is basically entry level. You're going to be there at most 4 years. You're going to move out. L5 is a terminal role, is what we call it, where you can be there at that level for indefinitely. And then L6 is where you start getting into like you're starting to peak into management a little bit there as far as your responsibilities and scope goes. But it's there's only 3 buckets, man. They're pretty broad.
Okay, fair enough.
L6 is pretty broad too.
Yeah. But one thing I was gonna say is that as you progress through these ranges, like it might be desirable to have like an exponential, like maybe an order of magnitude drop off. So if you have like 100 L5s, you may only want like 10 L6s, and you may only want 1 L7 for that number of engineers. So
that's pretty close to the way we try to follow it inside of Amazon. And I guess your point there is like a very small company, you alias that, and there's going to be 0 or 1.
Yeah,
If your
exactly.
company is 10 people, you'll have like 0 or 1.
Yeah,
senior.
exactly. So it gets very, very hazy, and also I mean, we're definitely getting off topic, but there is also potentially a recruiting problem, right? So if you're Amazon, it's a lot easier to like hire L7s, right? And if you're like a no-name company who's not profitable, like it may be very difficult depending on the circumstance, right? So, there's all kinds of things that play in here.
Yeah.
And I would say in general, but in the lower ranks, like the L3, L4 kind of range, the equivalent, I guess. I think that startups, I think startups tend to mistakenly, at their own peril, inflate people's titles, right? So it is not uncommon for me to see at startups, including companies I've worked for, with people with like 3 to 5 years of experience being called senior, right? And
do you think there's like an adverse incentive there where it's like, well, if we can't afford you either the notoriety of working for a larger company or the pay that is commensurate with that, so like maybe we'll inflate your title a little bit so that way like you have something your resume build, or
it's like, well, if you're a manager, right, and you're like star L4 comes to you, who's been very good, right, has done all that is required of them or whatever, comes to you and sort of subtly drops hints that they're going to leave unless you promote them because like they can just go somewhere else and get promoted. It's like tempting to like just do it, right? But the problem is, of course, like once you do it once, you kind of lose your moral high ground, and then you have to do it for everybody, and then like oh boy, so.
Another like semi off topic thing there, but a giant complaint we had at Amazon, like a lot of people had a lot of angst over this, was just how wide that L5 gap band was. So Microsoft, as opposed to Amazon, actually has very granular levels, and to my understanding, you're expected to get a promotion like every 1 or 2 years, essentially. Versus at Amazon, you can be in the same role, like it's like not uncommon for like 3 to 5 years, and it gets kind of logarithmic that the higher up the roles you go, like the longer and longer it takes to get promoted. I think there's something to be said there as opposed to just like the broad categories of like junior, mid, senior, to break up the pay bands internally to that. Like, so you have like a little carrot to chase.
Yeah.
So Microsoft does that a bit, and I'm wondering if that would be like a potential solution around the problem of title inflation, because I don't think their title actually changes, but their
Yeah.
pay band, like, level
Yeah.
kind of does.
Sure.
So
Sure.
I don't know, just
And I like that you brought this up, James. I think it's important for people to remember that, you don't necessarily have to align compensation with titles.
yeah,
Right.
100%.
You can certainly give people more money or, more options or whatever, more compensation, if they're doing a good job. Right. That's like okay to do. Like I think when we talk, when you and I are talking about ladders or titles or whatever, we're thinking more about responsibility, right? Like
Yeah, exactly.
what is this title signal in terms of like what I'm doing in my day-to-day work,
Yeah.
right?
And to be fair too, like not everyone has to strive to like at that point there about the logarithmic curve, like not everyone's going to end up being senior at the end of their career.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily expect that. I mean, yes, you can be senior in title, but there's a certain degree of responsibility that the higher and higher you go, that not everyone might want to do. If like you want to like raise a family, like, or like have time with your friends and whatnot, it's totally valid, totally acceptable not to just chase like the not the like a hedonistic treadmill, but like essentially like never stop climbing the ladder. You're allowed to get off at any point you want to.
Yes, or at least have a terminal role that you can get off at, right?
Exactly. I mean, I wouldn't be doing that at junior or something. But,
yeah. So actually, this is a good point. We can dive into this a little bit. So, what is you had mentioned it there, but it may not be familiar to the viewer. What is a terminal title or terminal role?
A terminal
sounds
role.
Scary, right? Sounds like you're gonna die, but
at Amazon it does have some of that scariness to it, because it's one of those, they have the whole forced attrition, undergraduate attrition policy. So there is a bit of a move up or move out there, and terminal role isn't as terminal as you think it could be. But most of the time when you say terminal role, it means like you could stick at this role indefinitely, essentially.
Right.
Like you're no longer like, there's no longer a move up or move out kind of deal. I'm not sure if they do that at startups or not. I'm not sure if most startups you've worked for have lasted long enough for that to be a concern.
Yeah.
But like, if someone just like not growing and whatnot, like, I think it's more applicable to the junior roles and whatnot. But like, you don't expect someone to stay junior forever. If you're junior after like 6 years of working somewhere, like it's really not.
There's some kind of alignment issue problem there, right?
Exactly.
Like either the company isn't right for you or you're not right for the company. There's got to be a problem there, right?
So we're kind of broadening the scope a little bit now beyond just like, well, what is a senior? Like a little bit now, like what is a junior? But like I think the motivation for that of like the move up and move out for junior is that I expect to provide juniors with more help than they provide the team back. And that's totally valid and totally okay. I'm not saying they provide zero help.
Yeah.
But there is a lot, like mentorship is a significant amount of effort and part of your job. And that's one of the things you have to do as you become more senior, is get better at mentoring and like, more apt at that. But so I think like once you become like mid-level there, like you're really like decently independent and you don't have to be handheld as much or at all. And that's something that would differ you from junior. But if you're just going to be junior forever, you're essentially being handheld the entire time. And it's kind of like, well, I'm not seeing a return on my investment in mentoring you anymore.
Right.
So why are you going to stick around?
Yeah. And I think this is a really important point, James. I like this terminology of investing in people, right? So
yeah, that's what it is.
If you're watching and you're a junior or even kind of a mid-level person or whatever, and you're concerned about your burden on the team, right?
I wouldn't be, first of all.
I wouldn't be. Yeah, exactly. I would take a step back and recognize that the people who are around you who are mentoring know what they got themselves into, right? They fully understand and see you for the investment that you are, and you shouldn't worry so much about like being a burden. Like throw that out the window, because actually one of the ways you
100%.
can be a burden is not asking for help when you actually needed it, right?
1,000% to that one.
Yeah. So that is to say, I think mentors expect you to make mistakes. They expect you to need help. They expect, their job is to put guardrails on you, to allow you to succeed, and to invest in you, right? And I think if you're working at a place where you don't feel invested in, you should leave.
You leave. You should be looking like immediately and leave, because if they're not investing in you, then that means they don't care about you. Or they don't care about you, why are you working there?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so now that we've gone a little bit into this, we can actually actually talk a little bit more about our original intention, which is, what does a senior engineer do? What is the responsibilities that they have that sort of distinguish them from their peers, right?
Well, I think I want to jump off the last point we made there. I think like one of the things you do as you become more senior is like you have to be better at mentoring people, and that
Yeah,
becomes like understanding that like I don't mean like individual juniors either, but I mean like it's kind of your entire team there. Like when you think of someone as senior, at least when I think of them, like what's the utility that I have personally gotten from people with the official title of senior, and that I felt that other people were looking at me for when I was like a more of a seniority, like term length of my role in some teams, was just being able to kind of evolve the team into the direction you need to like kind of ensure that everyone's engaged as well, that like they're getting something out of the project, to ensure that like your teammates, your underlings, your children are that they're growing, that they're becoming better engineers, like both like in their career and in like your team itself. And so like that kind of nurturing is what I feel the most critical part of being a senior. There is like you have to you're a force multiplier if you're a senior, which
yeah,
means you have to like raise up your forces, like raise an army essentially to tackle whatever problem comes at you.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, so
And what are some ways that a senior engineer might force multiply? What are some things so you had mentioned, for instance, engagement, right?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think if you're not passionate about it, you throw the term passion around all the time, but like there's a difference between like being like, oh, this is my passion, like I'm gonna like do this forever, like speaks to my soul, versus like I find this interesting, and like like I'm actually like a little bit excited, or like I have a decent, there's a concept of task saliency. Like it doesn't take me too much to get started in my work, to investigate this more. If you become disinterested or like jaded from your job and whatnot, like if you just like feel like your work is not appreciated, or like you're not growing yourself, you just as a human being become naturally disinterested in something, and disinterest makes you slower, makes you not think about or care about the stuff anymore. You don't have that like that background task running of your subconscious about like how you can like solve different problems, like where you think the work is going to go. And just as you check out more, you won't be as much of an asset to your team. And so if you're a senior, I think an important thing is to like recognize if that's happening, and to prevent that. More importantly, prevent, not just react to that happening. And of course, you can't control everything, but I think getting ahead of that, it's getting just getting ahead of that before it becomes a problem, and just ensuring that everyone is engaged is like one way you'd be able to like better evolve and manage your team.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I can add from my career, so there's something that actually I've been thinking about a lot lately, is maybe things like barrier to entry, right? So
Yeah.
as new people come on boarded, right? What is their
Oh yeah.
experience of interacting with the code base, or learning the business model, or whatever,
Yeah. Yeah.
or maybe things as simple as like maybe you have some segregated repos and you want more contributions from like a back-end engineer in a more front-end code
Yeah.
base, right? So there's a lot of like barrier to entry things that you can work on as a senior engineer, where you're like,
Or
you're
like
not even
spreading
like,
like being siloed or something too. Like if like one person's working on one task the entire time, like sometimes like I know this like kind of like mixes with the concept of a sprint planner or something, if you have that as a particular role at your company. But just understanding like like where the individuals in your team, where their skill sets lie, and like what parts of the code base they've touched. Sometimes it's nice to mix them around a bit, so you lessen the bus factor, and just if one, make it more exciting for them because they're working on different parts of the project now. Two, if someone hates their part of the project, a good way to change that up is to just change what they're working on. And
absolutely.
like three, like you can collaborate better then, because then more people have like eyes in a particular part of the project, and you're able to I don't want to get too much into the theory of like project management here, my thoughts on
Yeah.
that, but I think like recognizing that, like managing that kind of stuff is important for a senior, because as a senior engineer, you're an engineer first and foremost. You're more technical, and you probably have a better like acuity for those kinds of concerns, like how people on your team are doing, than like say like a manager who may or may not be technical, or may not be as focused in the actual project level details as you are.
Right, right, right.
I don't know.
Yeah, and you another thing you can focus on. So I guess what we're all trying to say here, right, to the viewer, is that you can take your own experience of like working on a code base and try to develop a skill of abstracting that to your team, right? Like what
Yeah,
engages
yeah.
me, what doesn't engage me. What is friction for me is probably potentially friction for other teammates, right? That could
I
be a
mean,
way to
not
find
necessarily,
problem,
but
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Even if it's not a friction for you necessarily, I think you can usually tell if someone in your team is having a friction with something.
Yeah.
And at that point, like you might want to like rearrange what they're working on. Just like if you ever see your teammates stop growing, you probably need to find like somewhere, plant them somewhere else. And if they don't grow there, then I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not going to be around too much longer. I don't know.
So one thing, one thing I wanted to touch on, James, is
Uh-huh.
a senior engineer, right, is still an engineer, right, and that is
Yeah, yeah,
distinct from a manager. However, a lot of the things that you and I have been discussing have been very support role-y, have
yeah, yeah.
been some kinds of identification that maybe a manager might be doing, and I just wanted to ask you, it seems like you're totally okay with the idea that senior engineers might be doing like partial sort of managerial type responsibilities, right?
I'm not sure what it was for like what's been so far in you and like your company so far, but in my experience and the people I've worked with and whatnot, the higher you go up on these ladders at Amazon, at least, the more I'd say both like at the team level and at the like business level, non-coding tasks you would take on. So every team is different, every organization is different, even like every individual senior themselves are different as far as like what they're apt at, like what they like, what they end up doing. But what was expected of our seniors at least is they'd have their finger on the pulse of the engineers, like we just mentioned a bunch. They would also like be involved in many more meetings regarding like the direction and future of the org, like kind of like as a filter, like the higher level thought there, and then they would think about how to possibly map that onto what their team would be working on. So it's like kind of at that nexus there, where like you're definitely more focused towards the technical side as opposed to like a technical project manager or a manager or someone else on the business side of it, but you're definitely a bridge there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah,
So
and I agree, man. I personally I think the best senior or senior plus engineers I've worked with have been kind of borderline managers, right?
yeah,
They might be like technically oriented managers, right, or something. Like it might be a kind of
yeah,
way to describe them, right?
yeah. I think that's fair, but I think it's I think one of the bigger differences there is like a senior engineer is still mostly focused, more so focused on the product and their individual team and their interaction with that individual team and elsewhere, versus a manager might be doing more of the people management, like performance review kind of stuff, like all that, the more of the dirty work, I'd say.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons like I personally want to be a manager, I mean, I'm sure it's different at Amazon compared to some other places, but managers aren't expected to code at all at Amazon versus
Yeah.
senior engineers. You'll still have a certain portion of your time coding. Sometimes they won't code at all, especially during what we like OLR or keep it just other OP1 and like times where we're doing much more planning compared to progress. But throughout the course of the year, they'll still on occasion they might do some normal tasks. When they do tasks, it's more so like either it's something very complicated that they wouldn't expect the rest of the people on the team to do, or there's a lot of ambiguity where the direction may go in many different ways. And being a senior, hopefully your experience has led you to be able to navigate ambiguity much better than other people on your team. And so if there's a high ambiguity task, you should be the one to take that so you don't fall off the cliff proverbially.
Right. Right.
Anyway,
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, James. So these are still
yeah,
senior engineers, and it's like, what kinds of coding do senior
yeah.
engineers do? And
Engineer is part of the title.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and I think you're right.
totally tough.
I think these sort of my experience has been super nebulous tasks, right? Or maybe some kind of like hyper load bearing complex
Yeah,
thing, or something, something like this is the kind of work that a senior engineer would do. And ironically, I do think that it's important to have at least one or two of these people around who are like really, really good at that kind of stuff. But I think if you want to level up and you want to become a senior engineer, I would actually focus on the other stuff.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
the soft skills and the people skills are way more important than
I
to,
agree.
if your goal is to become a senior engineer. I believe the soft side of things is much more applicable to your job than the hard skills side.
Yeah, and especially junior people, they really tend to focus on those hard skills, and they think it's like all about that, and that's actually
I,
one of the ways they show their inexperience, right? You know.
yeah. Oh yeah. No, I did that all the time back in the day.
Yeah, well, I
I'm
did
sure I
too.
still
I
do
did too. I
it.
mean, I'm
Yeah.
not. I'm not
Well,
saying.
'cause just to speculate about why that may be, it's like, well, like, as you're growing up in college and just getting into the style of programming and whatnot, I think like what's at the forefront of your mind is like, making making the products essentially, just like the more functional level things. But and you're kind of like because that's still novel to you, that takes up more of your mental energy, and so you'll focus more on that. Also, you have more room to grow in that area. But like seniors though, they've been around the actual business side more, and they've kind of seen how that's gone. You can't really learn that as well in college, and
Yeah,
like you're not expected to have that at the beginning of your career.
yeah,
So that's kind of the natural place for them to grow,
yeah.
is in the more like the more like nebulous questions and whatnot, and like the more abstract thought of like, how do I take a need and turn that into a product?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, this is a great jumping off point, James. One of the
Yeah,
things I was going to say that, you know,
yeah,
you see these sort of maybe junior or mid-level people, and one of the things, at least I get asked all the time, is like, how do I like level up? How do I become the senior engineer? Like they, sort
yeah,
of they want this roadmap or this like, check boxes that I can like do the thing, and now I'm senior or manager. And the
yeah, right.
irony of that question is that that is
Yeah,
exactly the opposite of what a senior engineer would do. Is
yeah,
part of being a senior engineer is maybe like technical judgment, right? So using and
yeah.
honing your skill of judgment as to like what are the problems I should be solving. Maybe we had talked about this before we started recording. This idea of like problem identification, right?
I think if you're asking that question, you're on the wrong path. But if you feel the need to ask that question, you should still ask that question so you can get back on the right path.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
makes any sense.
yeah.
But
And
like,
I'm to
don't
be
hold out
clear.
from like, yeah,
Yeah, I don't want to
yeah,
shame people, right?
yeah.
I'm not
I've totally
shaming.
asked that
Yeah,
before. Yeah,
I of course, we all have, right? And so, especially if we are below this terminal level, right, we might be very concerned about the things
or
that
where you want to
we're
be at your terminal level. Yeah,
yeah,
you're trying
yeah,
to.
exactly. We might be very concerned about these things,
It's
but
like chicken and the egg. Like, you don't know like what you need to be there until you're there, kind of deal. So like
yeah,
it's like I think having that. I think you should ask that question before you start trying to apply yourself to that level. Like the perfect time to ask that question is before you need to ask that question.
that's fair.
If that
That's
makes any
fair.
sense.
Yeah, yeah. And so I guess more concretely, this is like sort of
But you're
advice
right.
that
It's not
isn't. Yeah, yeah. This is sort of like advice that's not advice, right? Where it's to say that like we can't give you those check boxes, so we can't really give you advice. But maybe a piece of advice we could give you is be patient, right?
Yeah.
If you're 3 years in and you want to be a senior engineer, give yourself some more time. Like you're doing just
I,
fine. You have your
I also
entire
think
career ahead of you.
like the individual team, like I'm not sure how promotions work at like whatever company you're working for and whatnots, but I feel like what is expected of a senior engineer may differ between every individual team. Even like at Amazon, where they have like
Of
a
course, yeah,
freaking grid and whatnot of like like it's
yeah,
fairly well formalized. That doesn't mean it's like this like very binary yes no process. There's a lot of leeway and a lot of subjective judgment to actually getting
sure,
someone to senior, but so much. And so
yeah.
I think being tuned into your team there, like what problems actually need to be solved, to what you're getting into now, Eric. That problem identification is like the critical thing, and that may differ between teams, which is why there is not going to be a single checkbox list to go through.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And also, it can be a little bit more individual in the sense that, like, maybe maybe I am a little bit more hard skill oriented, right? So maybe those like
Nothing wrong with that.
ambiguous, nebulous things are like what levels me up, right? But maybe your more softy skills, you said mentioned that you like managers or whatever managerial tasks or whatever, like that can work for you as well, right? So. That's also the other reason there is no checkbox, right? Is we want to take advantage of people's interests and their natural abilities, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
So, indeed,
And, they have the concept of like breadth versus depth, which is a little bit adjacent to what we're talking about here. But like at Amazon too, they're like while there is some baseline they expect you to have and whatnot, like the absence of a weakness is not an indicator of strength, and vice versa. So if you're just like really strong technically in some ways, that still might be a viable path to senior for you at some company if they have the need for that kind of role.
Right.
You can still be senior within that domain of like just hard skills,
Right. Right.
or vice versa too. I've definitely known some people that like weren't as like not on my most recent team, but like I'd known some people previously at Amazon who had the title of senior and whatnot, and they were good at the soft skills, but they actually did not have the hard skills down as much as you would have expected and
Right.
whatnot. So
Right.
like once there's always leeway.
And all of these
And
people are definitely senior engineers, right?
oh,
Like
100%. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. No,
Yeah, yeah.
even if like you had like one or two interactions that may indicate contraindicate that, no, like everyone that I'm not 100%, I will say that much, but not 95, 99% of them are 100% senior.
This is
So
something that you reminded me of when you were speaking there, James, is that, another thing that I hear all the time is that like people are very worried about compensation early in their career.
yeah,
And
yeah.
they're like, I hear advice like I
Money.
should never go down, right? And always go up and all these other things. And I would say if you're early in your career, and when I say early, I mean honestly less than 10 years.
That's fair.
Your career is like probably your most valuable asset. It is literally an appreciating multi-million dollar value, like asset
Over
that
the
you
course of your
have.
lifetime, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and if you're in the first 5 or 10 years, like it's probably a little early to be optimizing for like compensation. So my advice would be if you find a job that will develop your career, will give you a new set of skills, will do something that you really are thinking, expand your capabilities, will develop your career in some meaningful way as far as you can tell, but it's a pay cut. As long as that pay is respectful, you should 100% take that job, right?
If you're not growing, you should leave your job. If you find somewhere else you think you can grow, even if it's a pay cut, go where you can grow. It will pay back later. Don't think like in the short term for at the expense of long term gains.
Yeah, exactly. This is a long-term investment, right?
Yeah, there's a reason you're going to college right now. Like yeah, like you could have more money in your pocket if like you go right out of like the high school to like I don't know whatever job you can get in this economy without a college degree, and you'll have much more money in your pocket every year. But
Yeah.
it's going to be better for you long term if you go and find something you like that you can actually invest in yourself and improve your long term career and open more doors for you.
Exactly. All right. So I think there's at least one more thing that I want to touch on because this was such an interesting thing. We were discussing before we started recording. You had this idea of a mushroom or a tree.
Oh yeah.
So to be clear, maybe you should explain the analogy before I spoil it.
I'm sure the mushroom has been said by some other people before. I think the tree is like what I'm trying to do is the counterpart to it. But there's a couple ways you can treat your peers, and if you're in a senior role, especially like your underlings, your children, you can either treat them like a mushroom or a tree. If you treat them like a mushroom, you kind of keep them in the dark, just feed them shit. Like you don't keep them involved, like plugged into the project and they like why they're doing some of the things they are doing. And like, if they do ask and whatnot, you're not like fully forthcoming for as far as your actual, like, your horizon, your planning, your expectations of like how this project or this organization is going to go. And I'm very much against that. I think that leads to jadedness and disengagement in the job. And I've seen that happen to way too many of my peers and whatnot, and myself at some points, as far as being treated like a mushroom. So I think instead of treating people like mushrooms, you should treat them like trees, where you kind of have to bring them to light a little bit. You just like let all of that knowledge and experience and just the greater like goal kind of shine it down on them as far as like whatever your project's going to do, clue them into it. You have to nourish them, water them and all that kind of stuff. Don't stress them out too much that they die early on. And I think that's a much, if you're trying to grow a forest, that's the only way you're going to be able to do it. Like a sustainable forest, you have to actually like feed and water them and provide light, as opposed to having a stinky, smelly mushroom farm that no one really wants to be in or stick around for a long time.
Yeah. Well, I personally really like the analogy. I think it's great, and it really kind of encapsulates a lot of the things that you and I were discussing this entire time. I'm talking about things like engagement, transparency, openness, allowing people to grow, right? Giving them ownership, making space for them, right? Trees cannot grow in like very crowded areas, right? All kinds of things. So, if you are a senior, if you want to be a better senior, treat people like trees. And if you want to become a senior, start seeing your peers as trees, and everything will just come to you, obviously.
Another good summary here for like how to like be a senior is to make sure you're keeping your eyes in the horizon and not your feet, kind of deal. Or like if imagine like you have a ship, and like your ship is your project, your team, your organization. You have to ensure that you spend so much of your time ensuring that you're staying on course. And so if you're getting frustrated, like as you grow into being a senior by all these meetings and stuff you're spending time in, keep in mind that it's much less expensive to fix the problem now than it will be down the line. Part of your job is ensuring that everyone is on the same page, so that way they understand what they need to actually work on. And so all those meetings you're doing, what the effect of that is like you're constantly writing the course of your ship, because if you just start neglecting that duty of yours, you're going to start going off course. And the way ships work, if you're trying to transit the Atlantic Ocean and whatnot, a little bit off course in the beginning, if you don't take the time to correct that, that little bit of angular distance will grow to be massive.
Yeah.
By the time you get to your destination, and you might like run out of like provisions to actually get to where you needed to go if you don't spend that continual time making sure you're staying on course.
Yeah. There's a certain level of vigilance to this, right? You know?
Yeah, it's the tedious thing. And like in my peer group, the most common complaint I heard about newly promoted senior engineers was how much time they spent doing that style of management compared to actual coding or engineering these days. But there really is a purpose for that. And the sad thing is you won't understand just how valuable that part of your action is, that part of your job is, until you neglect to do it. In which case, all of a sudden, everything around you is on fire, and you're sinking into the sea.
Yeah.
So don't go there.
Yeah. So I guess we can wrap up the discussion here. It's been great having you here, James. I really appreciate you coming on. I hope this is not the only time that you come on the show.
Well, we'll see how our schedules go. Maybe next week someone won't be on call and someone else won't have a hangover. And
yeah. Exactly. Well, anyway, it was a pleasure having you, James. So until next time.
Appreciate it.
Take it easy.
Sincerely appreciate it, man. And take it easy.